So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we're looking at Judith Butler's text, Gender Trouble. So we finished the first chapter. We looked at certain selected sections from the first chapter which are directly relevant for the purpose of this course. Now we move on to another chapter which is titled Subversive Bodily Acts. Now obviously subversion is a very political performance in Butler, especially when it's done through the body. And we've seen already how Butler looks at body as a performance, as a process of becoming, unbecoming and rebecoming. It's not really a passive entity, it's a productive entity. It's something which produces meanings, produces affect. So affect becomes a very important issue in Butler's analysis of gender. Now, when we come to subversive bodily acts, we'll see how Butler's looking at subversion through the body, inscripted through the body, embedded in the body, as well as extended onto the discursive apparatus around the body. So again, we're looking at a very important and interesting loop between embeddedness and extendedness, right? So the body is embedded. It is embedded in a social system. It is embedded, biologically, but at the same time, it's also extended. So there's an extended quality, a prosthetic quality about the body that is performed through gestures, rites, language, sartorial politics, etc. Now, this is what Butler says, and this should be on a screen highlighted in yellow, where she's saying, acts, gestures, and desire produce the effect of an internal core of substance, but produces this on the surface of the body. So the surface becomes the key thing. The surface becomes a key space for Butler. It's a site of subversion, surface. So superficiality or the surface quality of the body is something which Butler is celebrating. And this is very, very postmodernist, as I'm sure most of you would know, that it's not really looking for inner depth. It's not really looking for inner substance or any metaphysics of substance, but rather what it's interested in is a performative procedure through which the surface becomes, rebecomes, and unbecomes all the time. So it produces this on the surface of the body to the play of signifying absences that suggest but never reveal the organizing principle of identity as a cause. So identity becomes, it just becomes a performative thing. So, and the other important phrase that Butler uses over here is a play of signifying absences. So, it's a play. So there's a ludic quality about the body. It's a playful activity. And of course, we know play can actually become very, very political in quality. Play can be subversive in quality. Play can be, dismantling. So play, is that kind of a performance which is a mixture of seriousness and flippant quality. So that kind of a mixture, that very, very bastard quality about play is something which Butler is celebrating over here. It's not really a pure thing. It's a mixture, it's an entanglement, it's a compound of different things. So it's a play of signifying absences, and it's a very important term, signifying absences. So absences which signify things. So it's not really about any metaphysics of presence. It's actually about a play of signifying absences. So what is said, what is not said, all become equally important in this kind of a discourse analysis that Butler is doing. Now, that kind of signifying absence, that kind of a play of signifying absence, it doesn't reveal the organizing principle of identity as a cause. So it's not really about an organizing principle. It's not really about a core unity or a causal unity or a causal core that is being revealed through that play. So that's not really the issue away. That's not really the point of this play. The point of this play is to produce signifying absences on the surface. Right? It's not really about looking for an inner unity or an inner core or a causal core. So the causality becomes really a very redundant phenomenon in this kind of a play, or this kind of an analysis of play that Butler is doing. So such acts, gestures, enactments, generally constructed or construed, are performative in the sense that the essence or identity that they otherwise purport to express are fabrications manufactured and sustained through corporeal science and other discursive means. So again, there's certain things which Butler has highlighted for us, which obviously are the key words over here, performative and fabrication. So what is fabrication? So the whole identity becomes a fabricated process, and it's manufactured and sustained through corporeal science and other discursive means. So again, what we're looking at is a very interesting entanglement between corporeality and discursivity. So corporeality is a bodiness of the body, or the embedded quality of the body, which I just mentioned, and discursivity, it corresponds to the extended quality of the body, the way it connects to the discursive apparatus around the body. And both become very equally important. They both enter into some kind of a liminal loop which become a meaning-producing mechanism. But that meaning-producing mechanism is done through a manufacturing process. It's done through a fabrication. So it's not really about authentic meaning production. It's not really about the inner core of meaning that Butler is sort of examining or interested in. But actually, these are gestures, enactments, and which are performative in the sense they are fabrications which are manufactured and sustained. So this manufacturing of these identities or fabrications and sustaining these fabrications become equally important. And that process of manufacturing and sustaining these things are done through corporeal science and other discursive means. So corporeality and discursivity become important, they combine together in very important ways, and that becomes the process through which this performativity is done, is enacted, according to Butler. So that a gendered body is performative suggests that it has no ontological status apart from the various acts which constitute its reality. And this is a very, very political and radical thing to say that Butler is doing, and that is, when he's saying that a gendered body is performative, so what we're essentially saying is there is no essence, there is no ontological status, there is no ontological reality or core that is being produced and protected and promoted. That's not what it really is. But the body becomes a set of activities, various acts which constitute its reality. So the activities produce a reality. It's not really the other way around. So it's not really that there's a real core in there which produces the activities. It's the activities from the outside which produce the body. So what we can see quite clearly is that Butler seems to prioritize the discursivity more than the corporeality. So the discursivity produces a corporeality. It's actually coming from the outside. It's how you negotiate with the discursive apparatus. How do you negotiate? How do you navigate with the discursive apparatus around you, which makes you produces acts and activities which then produce a reality. It's the other way around. So it's a complete reversal of the ontological argument about the body being, some kind of an ontological core which is to be maintained, which is to be sustained, which is to be protected. But that's not what it really is. It's a complete reversal of that, what Butler is saying, that if there is any reality, that ontological reality is produced through activities. And of course, because it's produced through activities, it can be deproduced and reproduced. Right? So therein lies the textuality of the body. So like any text, it's a process of construction. And anything which can be constructed, obviously, can be deconstructed and reconstructed. So therein lies the political significance of the word fabrications and manufactured. So this is a manufactured process, a metonymic process, which brings in together different activities through which a reality is produced at any given point of time. But that reality, of course, is not permanent in quality. It's spatio-temporal in quality. It is produced at any given point of time, and that point of time is an assemblage of different material conditions, right? So it's not really an abstract ontological thing. It's a material discursive process through which this whole identity production is done, according to Butler, in a very performative way. Okay, so, and then she goes on to say, this also suggests that if that reality is fabricated as an interior essence, that very interiority is an effect and function of a decidedly public and social discourse, the public regulation of fantasy to the surface politics of the body, the gender border control that differentiates inner from outer and so constitutes the integrity of the subject. So you can look at these special metaphors Butler is using as really interesting and really complex, where she talks about gender border control, just like a border control, which is a very territorial thing where you allow and disallow certain activities. So similarly, that permitting and non-permitting of different activities take place at the level of the surface of the body, right? And therein lies the liminality of the body, therein lies the surface quality of the body, which becomes so important. And then Butler is saying what she's essentially saying over here, that if reality is fabricated as an interior essence, so interior essence is actually a fabricated process, a performative process. So that very interiority automatically becomes the function of a public and social discourse. So social discourse obviously relates to the activities, the discursive activities that take place, which produce the interiority, which produce the corporeality, as it were. So, and of course, the whole process of producing that corporeality, it also entails regulation of fantasies, right? So, this is a sort of Freudian metaphor that Butler is using, where the whole process of being civilized, the whole process of being an acceptable or conforming subject relies on your ability to suppress fantasies, your ability to regulate fantasies, which can potentially be anarchic in quality. And that regulation takes place in a very territorial way. So Butler looks at the body as a territory, territory, the surface of the body as a territory where, wherein, certain functions are allowed, certain functions are disallowed, and that allowing and not allowing certain functions become a very important thing for, the whole production of the subject depends on this allowing and not allowing of certain functions and the level of surface, as Butler examines it. Okay, so it differentiates inner from outer, and so institutes the integrity of the subject. So the whole idea of integrity is institutionalized to this border control mechanism, where the body, the surface of the body becomes a border, wherein that becomes a site of activities, allowed activities and non-allowed activities to take place. And how do you negotiate with that, whole idea of permissible activities and non-permissible activities? And that negotiation produces the integrity of the subject, right? So how integral the subject is, how, whether it's a conforming subject or a dissident subject or a transgressive subject, depends on the way it is negotiated at the side of the body, that's the surface of the body. So in other words, acts and gestures, articulated and enacted desires create the illusion of an interior. So it's so postmodern. So those of you who have read Lyotard, the postmodern condition would know that it's exactly the kind of vocabulary that Lyotard had to use. So any idea of interiority is a fantasy. Any idea of an essence is a fantasy, and that of course is a fabricated fantasy which is created through different negotiations, which is created through different activities, which is, sometimes can be conforming in quality, sometimes can be subversive in quality, etc. So in other words, acts and gestures, articulated and enacted desires create the illusion of an interior and organizing gender core. So this whole idea of an organized gender core, an organized interior, is an illusion which is created by these activities. An illusion discursively maintained for the purposes of the regulation of sexuality within the obligatory frame of reproductive heterosexuality. So again, very, very loaded political terms, and that illusion must be discursively maintained. So there should be a compulsory discursive maintenance of that illusion. Why so? Because for the purpose of regulation of sexuality within the obligatory frame of reproductive heterosexuality. So that becomes a compulsory frame, the obligatory frame of compulsory reproductive heterosexuality. So within that frame, within that obligatory, compulsory, discursive frame, that illusion of an interiority must be discursively maintained. So in other words, what Butler is saying, that heterosexuality, or reproductive heterosexuality, which produces children, which produces progeny in a way, that becomes the dominant narrative, that becomes a grand narrative. And within that grand narrative, different sides, different activities are conforming to this grand narrative in a way which is ensuring a discursive maintenance of that grand narrative. So it's like a maintenance of a system, right? So the big grand system, the mother computer, the mother system, that needs to be maintained through different discursive activities. And of course, that discursive maintenance can take place only through certain kind of regulatory sexuality. So certain sexualities are, alternative sexualities which are banned, which are forbidden, and of course certain kinds of other sexualities that get dominant and dominantly discursivized in a way, right? So heterosexuality, or compulsory reproductive heterosexuality, becomes that kind of a grand narrative within which consumes all the other kinds of sexualities. And of course anything which doesn't fit in into that category becomes deviant, becomes transgressive by default, right? So as you can see, this passage which I've chosen for this course is a very political and radical passage, and what Butler is essentially saying is that we are all surface creatures, we are all creatures of the surface, so we are always negotiating and navigating with the discursive apparatus through our body, on our body, right? So the body becomes a site, the body becomes an activity, the body becomes a play, and all that leads on to different models of subversion, different models of conformity, which are variously negotiated with by at any given point of time by the human subject. And the whole idea of the human subject is a construction, as we know. It's a construction which is a fabricated illusion, and that illusion is a necessary illusion for the integrity of the subject, right? For the coherence of the core of the subject. There's a causal quality of the core, there's a coherent quality about the core which needs to be maintained by the subject. So the subject becomes a very important process, a very important production process, which carries integrity, coherence, etc. So all these become very important points within a grand narrative of reproductory heterosexuality, and that's something that Butler is just highlighting for us. Okay, so as we can see, as I've said already, that the whole idea of the whole vocabulary, the rhetoric of Butler is very postmodern, and obviously she's drawing to a large extent from post-structuralist feminism. That's the reason why she seemed to have preferred she obviously prefers irrigare over before, and we've seen how the whole point that she's drawing on irrigare, the vocabulary of irrigare, the rhetoric of irrigare, and also the epistemic model of irrigare as a French post-structuralist model that sort of lends itself in this kind of analysis by Butler. Okay, so we'll just move on quickly, and then we talk about how the last bit where she's talking about the whole idea of the drag. So what is a drag, and how is a drag an important function of gender, right? So that's something which Butler is very, very interested in. So the anatomy of the performer is already distinct from the gender of the performer, and both of these are distinct from the gender of the performance. Then the performance suggests a dissonance not only between sex and performance, but sex and gender and performance. As much as drag creates a unified picture of a woman, what its critiques often oppose, it also reveals the distinctness of those aspects of gendered experience which are falsely naturalized as a unity through its regulatory fiction of heterosexual coherence. In imitating gender, drag implicitly reveals the imitative structure of gender itself, as well as its contingency. Indeed, part of the pleasure, the giddiness of the performance is a recognition of radical contingency in the relation between sex and gender in the face of cultural configurations and of causal unities that are regularly assumed to be natural and necessary. In a place of the law of heterosexual coherence, we see sex and gender denaturalized by means of a performance which avows their distinctness and dramatizes the cultural mechanism of their fabricated unity. So in other words, what Butler says over here is that the whole performance of the drag, the imitative performance of gender, it has a hypermimetic quality about it. Now, what do we mean by hypermimetic? It's mimicry about mimicry. It's mimicking the entire process of mimicking. So it becomes spectacularly evident that this is a process of mimicry that's happening. And that spectacle of mimicry, that larger-than-life quality about mimicry, that we know it's mimicry, the artificiality which is absolutely evident and spectacularly evident in the process of mimicry, that becomes a very political performance, because what that does, essentially, is that it shows the seams that are woven into the fabricated unity of gender, right? So the whole seamlessness of gender, the whole seamlessness of the dualism of gender, man versus woman, etc., that seamlessness is cracked open completely. And what we see in its place is a constructed quality which is revealed spectacularly and evidently by the hypermimetic process, by the imitating process of the drag. So again, this is very, very postmodern, because if you make an analogy between this and postmodern metafiction at a narrative level, that's exactly what metafiction does. And that is, it completely imitates the process of writing fiction. It completely imitates the process of designing a narrative. It constantly tells you this is a design, this is an artificial thing. And the artificiality is something which is part of the politics of postmodernism, that is telling you that any act of narration, any act of narrative control is actually an act of construction. But more often than not, when it comes to classic realism, that act of construction is effaced away. And what we see instead is a seamless process, a seamless narrative, which we consume quite quickly. Now, that seamlessness is also operative in gender. And when it comes to the drag, what Butler is saying is that drag is political in quality because it is hypermimetic, and because it's hypermimetic, it foregrounds the artificiality of gender processes. It foregrounds the artificiality of gender constructions, and that foregrounding is a political thing that the drag is doing. The fact it's telling you spectacularly and evidently that this is an act of construction, and anything which can be constructed is textual in quality, and that textuality can be deconstructed and reconstructed all the time. So the drag becomes a very, very hypermimetic, deconstructive process which reveals the seams of gender, which reveals the constructed quality of gender according to Butler, and that denaturalizes, as Butler suggests, the cultural mechanism of the fabricated unity. So the whole process of naturalization, which is the way in which every grand narrative is formed, it becomes naturalized. And we've seen already, reading Butler, how the process of naturalization, it entails a degree of repetition, reiteration, and normalization. You keep repeating something, you keep reiterating something, and then time comes when you don't really realize there's something out there. You internalize it. So every act of naturalization is an act of internalization. And now what the drag does, because it reveals to you the spectacular quality of the gender constructedness, and that denaturalizes it. You become aware when you look at a drag performance, you become aware that this is a construction, you become aware that this is a performance, and that therein lies the political performative quality of the drag, therein lies the radical quality of the drag, which obviously is celebrated by Butler in a very postmodernist, post-structuralist spirit. Okay, so and then we come to the last bit in Butler's analysis, and that is it's a very, very political thing, and this is what I mean, and the reason why I've selected the passages quite carefully, as you can see, because there's a dialogue, there's a narrative going on over here, which I would like to sort of convey through my reading of Butler. And this is a point in the book where Butler talks about the relationship between parody and pastiche, and she obviously says that these are different ontological, different performative categories, and it's important to map out the differences, and Butler seems to prioritize one over the other, which we'll see in a moment. But then this is how quoting Frederick Jameson's essay, Postmodernism and Consumer Society, where Jameson talks about the Marxist, Jameson talks about the whole idea of postmodernism and how the whole negotiation with parody and pastiche takes place. And we see how Butler takes on from there, draws on it, and then delivers something which is very original, very radical on her own, and connects it to the whole idea of performativity in gender. So this is what Butler says about Jameson. According to Frederick Jameson, or Jameson's Postmodernism and Consumer Society, the imitation that marks the notion of an original is characteristic of pastiche rather than parody. So pastiche is more important than parody, and not more important, but the imitation is more pastiche than parody. And this is what Jameson says, and Butler quotes Jameson over here. Pastiche is like parody, the imitation of a peculiar or unique style, the wearing of a stylistic mask, speech in a dead language, but it's a neutral practice of mimicry, without parody's ulterior motive, without the satirical impulse, without laughter, without that still latent feeling that there exists something normal compared to which what is being imitated is rather comic. Pastiche is blank parody that has lost its humor. So, this is a very, very political and very complex difference that Jameson is mapping out, and Jameson is saying that, parody, although it mocks something, it satirizes something, it subverts something, it deconstructs something, it has this residual presence with that something that is still there. So there is a degree of at least a spectral presence, a residual, lingering presence of the normal or the core, which is being mocked, which is being subverted, which is being derided or whatever, or deconstructed. But pastiche doesn't really have any core at all. Pastiche has no normal against which it situates itself. So pastiche is parody gone too far. Pastiche is parody that's lost its humor. Pastiche doesn't require any laughter. Pastiche doesn't require any ulterior motive. So there is no ulterior motive in pastiche. Parody retains an ulterior motive because it retains a sense of an origin. It retains some sense of a normal which is still there, which is being mocked, which is being parodied, which is being subverted. But pastiche does away with any sense of origin. Pastiche does away with any sense of metaphysics of a sense. So pastiche has a sense of liquidation about it. It's completely exhausted. It is done. It is closed. It is shut down, liquidated. There's no interior motive left. There's no interior core left, which is being parodied. That necessity of an interior core is done away with. And what we have instead, that it's a blank parody. So there's a blankness, there's an exhaustion, there's a complete liquidation which is there in pastiche. It doesn't really require any norm which is being subverted. It doesn't require any normative presence within its discursive structure. Parody requires a normative presence. Parody requires a normative existence, a normative structure, which it will then parody and deconstruct and deride and move away from. But pastiche doesn't even require that. So pastiche becomes a more extreme extension of parody. It's a parody which has lost its sense of humor. So there's no humor left in pastiche. There's a blankness which is pervasive in any sense of any performance of pastiche. Now, Butler draws on this, and then she offers something which is very, very radical, as we'll see. And the loss of the sense of the normal, however, can be its own occasion for laughter, especially when the normal, the original, is revealed to be a copy and an inevitably failed one, an ideal that no one can embody. Now, this is a very key difference that Butler is mapping out, because Jameson seems to suggest there's no laughter left in Pastiche, there's a normal left in Pastiche, and Jameson seems to have some sense of a nostalgic quality, nostalgic idea about this sense of Pastiche not having anything left at all. Now, that nostalgia is completely absent in Butler, and Butler actually celebrates the lack of normalcy or the absence of normalcy. And Butler celebrates the fact that a passage reveals to us that there was no normal left, and there was no normal at any time, there was no normative at any time, there was no original at any time. And therein lies the laughter of Pastiche, the fact that it reveals to you there was never any normal, there was never any neutral, there was never any origin point. And that neverness, which is being conveyed through Pastiche, becomes for Butler the more radical quality of Pastiche, the more the comic, the more ludic quality of Pastiche, which ought to be celebrated from a postmodernist perspective. And this is exactly what she's saying, that the original in a Pastiche is revealed to be a copy, so it's inauthentic. So everything is revealed to be inauthentic in Pastiche. There's no authentic origin left. There's no authentic origin at any given point in time in a Pastiche. So while Parody retains a sense of an authentic origin point, which is then derided, deconstructed, and attacked, Pastiche doesn't really require, or Pastiche reveals that there was nothing which is original, there was nothing which is authentic at any given point of time. And therein lies the political quality of Pastiche. So in this sense, laughter emerges in a realization that all along the original was derived, right? So the realization that there was no original at any given point of time. Therein lies the laughter of Pastiche, according to Butler. So this is a very, very complex and radical retelling of Frederick Jameson's difference between Pastiche and Parody. And that's something that we need to bear in mind very, very carefully, especially looking at the various configurations of gender that Butler is studying. So Parody by itself is not subversive. There must be a way to understand what makes certain kinds of parodic reputations effectively disruptive, truly troubling, and which reputations become domesticated and recirculated as instruments of cultural hegemony, right? So what Butler is saying that parody by itself is not really funny all the time, it's not really subversive all the time, and what needs to be borne in mind, what needs to be considered is what certain kinds of parodic reputations effectively disruptive, right? So they disrupt effectively, they are truly troubling, but there are certain other kinds of reputations which become domesticated, which becomes very much part of the mainstream, and then subsequently recirculated as instruments of cultural hegemony. And that's a very key point, that how parody can be consumed within cultural hegemony is something that Butler is examining over here. And she's saying we need to be very careful as students of culture, students of gender, to see how certain kinds of parody lend themselves to cultural hegemony, lend themselves to mainstream cultural configurations, and far from being radical, they become reified as mainstream mechanisms of culture, and that consideration must be always there in our study of parody as examined by Butler. So we'll stop at this point today, and we'll conclude this text in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.